Let's go on a photo walk. Do some photography, talk photography. Whatever your camera brand, make, model, manufacturer, doesn't matter. Whether you're shooting digital, film, RAW or JPEG, medium format, 35mm, doesn't matter. It's all fine. Point and shoot. Your phone. Fine also. But the thing is, I am going to have to narrow this down a little bit. I can't go off in that many directions or my brain will pop. So I'm going to assume that we're looking at either a DSLR or mirrorless digital camera. And so let's start there. You're looking to buy your first camera. Which one's better? A DSLR or a mirrorless camera? Well, neither really. The question is kind of without substance, because a mirrorless camera is literally a DSLR without a mirror. And that's it. A mirror previously solved the problem, which can now be solved a different way, with a digital screen. So one isn't really better than the other. They're slightly different experiences, but even then, with each subsequent generation, the difference in the experience is getting less and less pronounced. I mean, that is if you want it to. Depends on how you use it. And while it doesn't have to be this way, it tends to be this way. What I'm about to say tends to be true. Though it's also kind of arbitrary. But DSLRs are superior in the experience of looking through the viewfinder, because you are actually looking through the lens, like optically, in an analog way. But with a mirrorless camera, you're looking through the viewfinder, you're actually just looking at a screen. Some of them are very good screens, but a screen nonetheless. However, an advantage that mirrorless has is that generally, if not always, you get a second screen on the back of the camera that unfolds or tilts out, rotates. Very useful for achieving different kinds of angles without having to be a contortionist or an acrobat or to constantly shoot from your knees like I used to do. Now I have very bad knees. Wonder why. Mirrorless cameras are newer and have kind of displaced DSLRs in terms of what giant companies are developing and pushing, and will therefore receive all future innovation improvements. Because the industry has just latched onto mirrorless as the hot new thing, but there's no actual physical, intrinsic reason that DSLRs couldn't receive the same innovations. They're just not going to, because reasons. And by reasons, I mean money. And I'm not saying this is evil or something, I'm just describing the way it is. But the good news is DSLRs are already perfect. They're solid, mature tech, other than the sad reality that all cameras simply wear out over time. They could go on from now until eternity and still be just as awesome without needing any further changes. But the side of all this that's good for us is that there's an incredible used market of DSLRs that are ridiculously amazing, going for a fraction of their actual real-world value, plus the lenses that go with them. Here's my take, though. If you want my actual opinion, cutting through all the diplomacy and attempt to include everyone, here it is. For shooting people, I prefer mirrorless, mostly due to easier and more accurate autofocus, but also a few other niche reasons, like being able to adapt vintage lenses. But another big factor with mirrorless I've already talked about is the ability to angle the back screen, and that really helps a lot in terms of getting more dynamic shots of people. For nature, landscapes, street photography, I prefer a DSLR. Due to its simpler autofocus, it's not looking for patterns or faces or eyeballs in the rocks, and you're not having to dig through settings, menus, disable tracking. But also they're just more fun to use. Looking through an optical viewfinder, or a viewfinder in general, is a more fun way of interacting with a camera. And occasionally a digital viewfinder, or electronic viewfinder actually, that's what it's more often called, or EVF for short, they will just outright fail you. If you're in a super bright environment, you're in the snow or something, with full-on sun. Good luck. That's my experience, at least. You just can't see. But an advantage that mirrorless has is that, like, let's say you're shooting a bride and groom against the sunset. Well, it's not going to burn your fucking eyeballs out because you're just looking at a screen. I've definitely damaged my vision over time shooting brides and grooms against sunsets. But I'm not using a DSLR today. I am shooting with my mirrorless camera for various reasons. Mostly I just want to. That's why. But also, this particular camera body is kind of new to me. I've owned it for 5 or 6 months. And, well, the segue might be so smooth you might not realize I'm getting into a very important point. So I interrupt this segue to call your attention to the following. It's really important to be in sync with your camera, which means practice with it. Lots and lots. Lots with 37 O's and 5 exclamation points. Know your gear. But also just practice in general. You know, if you don't know what you're doing, you need to practice. If you do know what you're doing in a general sense, but you have some new unfamiliar piece of gear, don't just drag it along to a paid gig. You need to spend some time getting to know what to expect from it, what its limitations are. But if you're just starting out, the gear itself is not going to be the primary concern. You just need to practice, period. Just shoot, and shoot some more, all the time. What's the secret to becoming good at this? That is, doing it a lot. And that's it, that's literally it. You cannot get good at it if you don't do it. If you only do it occasionally, and you wonder why you're not improving, it's because you aren't doing it enough. But if you really are getting out there and practicing a lot, but you still feel like you're not improving, you probably are improving. It's just probably happening gradually, and so you might not be noticing. But also the reality is, you're doing the right thing, but just not enough time has elapsed to get to where you want to get. And the only thing in your way between where you are now and where you want to be is just more time practicing. Practice your ass off and you will improve. And if that's not your thing, if you don't want to practice, understandable, I guess, but also you're not going to improve. If you think otherwise, that's an absurd expectation. I do think it's possible once you reach a certain level of experience, having first practiced lots, where you can make some improvements kind of in the abstract, sitting around strategizing. But initially you can't. I promise you can't. But assuming you've practiced, eventually you're going to get better. And when you reach that point, don't overestimate your abilities. This is a huge pitfall. Yes, appreciate the work you've done and the results you've obtained. Appreciate how far you've come. But don't stop to congratulate yourself too much. If you're already content with where you are, then all your progress is going to come to a screeching halt. You will have no reason to work to try to get better if you already think you're awesome. And I'd say this wipes out like 50% of photographers. They advance from a 1 to a 2, so to speak. But then they're just a 2 for the rest of their lives. And don't copy. Don't with 128 O's. That is not a shortcut. There are no legitimate shortcuts. Anything that seems like a shortcut is actually just an obstacle waiting to derail you. And it might take you years to even realize that it's happened, and then possibly years just to get back to where you were before. Maybe it's a shortcut to praise, but if all you want is praise, there are easier ways of achieving that. Shortcuts equal bad at photography probably forever, and plagiarism equals you being kind of a gross person. If you aspire to be creative, good news, you can be, you just have to work at it. You actually don't have to be a thief or a fraud to get there. That must feel horrible. And the truth is, you're just going to discover that whatever shot you want to rip off can't be ripped off, because it looks the way it looks due to all sorts of organic reasons that you can't possibly know or replicate. Instead of going that route, you can just work hard. If you really want it, you'll get there. If you want to receive praise for being creative, but you're neither creative nor willing to work at it, then fuck you. If you don't know what to do with the bride and groom's hands, and you get some ideas by looking at someone else's work, and you keep that in mind as like something you can pull out when people are looking a little awkward, cool. I don't think that's stealing at all. There's gray area, tons. Because you produce some work that looks like some other work, that is also not necessarily plagiarism. I mean, optics and light, the types of matter available on this planet, are the same for everybody. Yeah, a lot of images will just look alike, by accident. But I feel it must be said, even though it might sting. If you intentionally take a photo inspired by another photo, I feel that you are misunderstanding the scope of that word, that concept. There is indeed already a word for that. Plagiarism. Inspired by something is different. It works more like this. Like, oh hey, I feel a strong connection to 1980s rural America. I want to communicate that to a viewer. Possibly someone who's never experienced that or doesn't feel the way I feel. I was inspired by my childhood experiences. You know, see the difference there? Don't be inspired the way a Xerox machine might perhaps become inspired. If that's a little hardcore, my apologies. I'm just passionate. But okay, if you manage to make it through that, here are some tips. Have a subject. Be specific. If we want to consider this a rule and you want to break the rule, fine. But don't start out breaking the rule. Live within the confines of that rule for a while, understand it, and then experiment with breaking it. Or don't. 1 million second shooter / photographer trainees tagging along with me to weddings later, and I can tell you that most new photographers suffer from this problem. I look at their photos and I don't really understand what it is a photo of. And to some degree, it can be covered up with technique improvements, and therefore you could potentially be screwing this up years down the road and not realize it if someone doesn't point it out to you. So I think it's really important to get a handle on that right away. You've got to be thinking about what you're shooting and what you're going for. You have to have some intention. Overall, you need to have a vision. And that's all it takes. Have a vision. If you're going for something, doesn't matter what, then you're probably doing it right. Make it clear there was an intention behind the shot, which of course requires having an intention while you're shooting it. And you can't somehow magically create intention during the editing process. It's too late at that point. People talk about storytelling in an image, which that idea sounds so lovely to me. I genuinely adore that sentiment. But I can't really relate to that. I don't know what that is. Maybe that's another way of saying what I'm saying here, or maybe it's not. Maybe I've yet to discover what that is. So don't let what I say on the subject be your only source of information if you're a beginner. There's way more to all of this and other ways of looking at it, better ways of explaining it that will resonate better for you. But this is how I think of it, and I'm just sharing that. So practice. Don't waste time congratulating yourself. Don't copy from other photographers' work. Have an intention behind everything you shoot. After that, learning to set your exposure manually would be the next most important thing to tackle. And then after that, light is the next most important thing to become a student of. A photograph is literally light, captured on a sensor or piece of film. So just as one could never, become a skilled baker as long as they don't know where the flour should go. Same with light as a photographer. If your genre is people, then some sort of posing knowledge is probably nearly as important as light. However, you really can't cheat with light, but you kind of can with posing. You can just tell your subject or your couple or whatever, act natural, hold hands, pretend I'm not here, ignore me. I give those sorts of instructions all the time. None of that requires a deep knowledge of posing. So in that sense, even for portraits, light is more important than posing. Composition, though, is next in importance, in my opinion. If the light is right, the technique is good, the pose looks nice, you can actually have a pretty decent photo even if the composition is boring. Of course, you don't want the composition to be boring. Thus, next, work on composition. And with composition, when in doubt, just fill the frame with your subject, and you can experiment with more interesting ideas down the road. But as you're working on it, let this idea guide you. That what you want to try to do is to make a complete image every time. You want to produce an image that is in itself a complete work, doesn't require any external context. Does it feel like a finished, complete thing, or does it feel like one word in a sentence, one sentence in a paragraph? Editing is such a pitfall and such a hindrance to your progress. What's good about your images shouldn't be coming from the editing process. Or, as it's commonly phrased, get it right in camera. At least try. The act of trying alone will make you a better photographer. But if you are basically getting it right in camera, yet you find yourself spending exorbitant amounts of time editing anyway, yeah, maybe you're creating a timeless masterpiece. More likely you're just fucking up your images in slow motion. If you spend more time editing than shooting, I feel like you're doing it wrong. And the greatest piece of advice I have is to take fewer shots, not fewer overall. Shoot more subjects, but fewer shots of each subject. 1 or 2, or a maximum of 3, and then move on. But sadly, I'm out of time. Had more stuff I wanted to get to, but next time.